Okay. Okay, so today's March 24th, and our topic for agent development today is compensation and clients. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation on the screen for you, and then I will email a copy of the packet of information that I'm going through. I'll email that to all of you, as well as a copy of the recording. And then just for future reference, I've already put this packet of information in Dropbox that's available to all of you in the office. So it's in the buyers and agency folder, and it's called compensation and clients. And then it's dated for today's date, because I realized while I was in there, as we talk about these agency things, things are changing, well, in our industry every month and sometimes every year. So that's why I thought it would be important to date things. So I'll email a copy of the packet, but then it's also available in Dropbox, just so you all have access to it at any time. Because I think this is good information to have, especially for newer agents, because there were lots of changes that occurred back in 2019 and 2020. What this will do is explain kind of how all this came about and why we're where we're at today, and then how to best work with it, and basically how to ensure that you're getting the compensation you're looking for while you're working with clients. So first off, real estate is your business, right? There's nothing absolutely wrong with approaching the purchase and sale of real estate as a business. Yes, we put our clients' interest ahead of everyone else's, including our own, but that doesn't mean that we have to work for nothing, or that we have to work for whatever they want to pay us, meaning the seller and the listing broker, right? Because it's the listing broker that is negotiating the commission for the selling office. And so these days, as we're seeing selling office commissions come down, if you don't necessarily want to leave it up to the listing broker and seller to determine your pay, you can use a buyer's agency agreement to basically set your own minimum compensation. And when you do this, you're not putting your interests ahead of your clients for what you ask for or receive. The compensation you're worth, I'm just messing up some of this. I need to pay more attention to my notes. You're not putting your interests ahead of your clients when you ask for and receive the compensation that you're worth, as long as you provide the services that you commit to on behalf of your clients. And so we're going to go through that part too. So how we ended up at this point is that back in 2019, there was a class action antitrust lawsuit filed against the National Association of Realtors, 10 MLSs, and 4 of the largest brokerage franchises, including RE/MAX. RE/MAX was one of the 4 that was named. It alleges that sellers are being required to pay buyer brokerage compensation without the ability to negotiate. However, that isn't necessarily true. They also allege that it's to pad the pockets of fellow brokerages because buyer brokers do not have any value in the transaction. Well, obviously, gosh, that isn't true, especially in today's market, right? But this was back in 2019 when it was less of a seller's market and less competitive. So I could see how maybe they could try to argue that. It also claims that buyer brokers will not show if commission is low. And so this pushes up the fees to sellers unfairly. This is still in court and has not been resolved. There are at least 3 other class action suits that are being heard on the same issue against various MLSs, brokerages, and in some cases, the National Association of Realtors. So that's kind of how this all came about. And then since then, the National Association of Realtors' response was that the facts that were presented are just wrong, and that they're just wrong on the law, that the economics of the MLS does work, that commissions are negotiable. They're negotiable between sellers and listing brokerages, as you're aware. They're also negotiable between brokerage companies and they're also negotiable between buyers and buyer brokerages. Most buyers do not have extra cash at closing to pay for their buyer's brokerage, right? As we know, most these days are saving up their closing costs and have some sort of a minimum down payment. But you know, it wasn't that long ago. And actually just last year, I sold to some buyers that didn't have closing costs or a down payment either, right? There's those zero down programs that you may hear of. So there are buyers out there that have no cash at all. And so in some cases, we can attempt to negotiate a commission from the seller through the purchase and sale agreement. If there is no selling office commission offered, or if it's lower than what we want to be paid. However, that requires a buyer agency agreement. And so I foresee that as we continue to evolve over the next couple of years, I think buyer's agency agreements are going to become more and more important. Like I've told all of you, I don't necessarily always get it signed. I get it signed when it's necessary, but I'm hearing and I can see that it may become necessary for all of us to have signed buyer's agency agreement, which is why I wanted to cover this, so that we can all start planning for it and be better prepared. Buyers, rather than having cash, would rather have it a part of the transaction, right? They don't have, but there are issues because with VA financing, a buyer can't pay the commission. It currently goes against the Veteran Affairs financing requirements that require the seller to pay it. So in fact, I just recently saw a case where someone was contacting the Washington Realtors legal hotline attorney, asking her if that was discrimination on the part of a seller or the Veterans Administration or anything like that. And the answer was, well, no, because veterans aren't a protected class, at least who knows, right? That could change, but they aren't currently a protected class. So unfortunately, it's just one of those things where if a vet wants to use VA financing, then the seller is going to have to pay the commission. So really the end result of everything that's been going on the last few years is that, if anything, safer for buyer's agents to use buyer's agency agreements, just confirm with their clients what their minimum compensation is, so they don't get stuck with something less than what their minimum may be. And so there's a page in the packet that I'll email you and that's available on Dropbox that explains the economics of buying a home. And this is one of the things that the Realtors Association is working on. So this is the piece that comes from the National Association of Realtors. While we are doing what we can to advocate for buyers, this gives you an example of, you know, the typical American household has an average of $8,863 in the bank. Gives you some stats and stuff, and how much harder it's going to be for them to save up money to pay for a buyer's agent. So it's just not necessarily feasible. But in the meantime, while this is still in court, back in November of 2020, the Department of Justice filed a complaint and proposed settlement to resolve the investigation into several NAR real estate brokerage rules and practices. The DOJ challenged NAR's rules that prohibited an MLS from disclosing to potential home buyers the amount of commission a buyer brokerage would earn from a purchase, allowed buyer brokers to advertise their services as free to home buyers, enabled buyer brokers to filter MLS listings based on commissions offered and exclude lower commission homes from buyers' consideration, and limit lockbox access to NAR affiliated brokers. So those are all things that we had to stop back then. But then back in July of 2021, the DOJ unilaterally withdrew from the settlement and voluntarily dismissed its complaint before the federal court and held a public interest hearing and entered a final judgment. And so they indicated that they intend to investigate numerous rules and practices, notably NAR's participation rule that requires agents listing homes on an MLS to make blatant unilateral offers of compensation, and NAR's clear cooperation policy that requires MLS members to list a home on the MLS within 1 business day. And so because all of these things, there have been some changes to the MLS rules and code for 2022. So although the proposed settlement between NAR and the DOJ has reached an impasse at this point, the following were made to the MLS rules, which will become effective the first quarter of 2022 and follow the mandates made in the original settlement. So then these are the changes. So first, display of listing broker offer of compensation. This requires all MLSs to include the listing broker's offer of compensation for each active listing displayed on its consumer-facing websites and in MLS data feeds provided to participants and subscribers. And that is happening in the MLS. The Northwest MLS started doing that in the fall of 2019. Information about offers of compensation must be accompanied by a disclaimer stating that the offer is made only to participants in the MLS where the listing is filed. That's all included within our listing agreement. There's also a policy that prohibits MLS participants and subscribers from representing that their brokerage services to a buyer, client, or customer are free or available at no cost to their clients, unless the participant or subscriber will receive no financial compensation at all from any source of those services. So I don't think that that necessarily applies to us, but in the past, prior to 2019, there were lots of advertisements that buyer brokers were making that, hire me, I'm free, you don't pay for my services, that sort of thing. And so that is one of the things that has come out of this, is that we're in a way just creating a lot more transparency about the process. And so although the buyer doesn't pay, they need to understand that it is the seller paying. And so the services are not free. Realtors must not represent that their brokerage services to, I guess that is all, that's what we already covered. But this is about, so in addition to the MLS policy, now it's also a part of the realtor's standard of practice. So that's what this is pointing out. So we have to follow that rule now within the Northwest MLS, as well as through the National Association of Realtors. And then moving into the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics were recently updated to give us direction on the disclosure of compensation to clients. So when entering into listing contracts, realtors must advise sellers and landlords of the realtor's company policy regarding cooperation and the amounts of any compensation that will be offered to sub-agents, buyer, tenant agents, and brokers acting in legally recognized non-agency capacities. So ensuring that a seller knows everyone that they're going to be compensating. And any potential for listing brokers to act as disclosed dual agents or buyer tenant agents. So the standard of practice 1-12 was updated, and then also 1-13. So 1-13 has more to do with tenant agreements, but all very similar to what I just said regarding standard of practice 1-12. So to get down to the nitty-gritty of everything, we must stop saying things like this to sellers. The commission we charge is blank, and then we pay a percentage or a portion of that to the co-op brokers. And if we don't pay this amount, no one will show your listing. Well, that isn't necessarily true. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of agents out there that are willing to work for next to nothing. So we can't necessarily say that. All that we can do is talk about how we have a listing fee and then we recommend a particular percentage for a co-op fee.
So the co-op fee is the
It's the
selling agent,
commission.
the
Mhm.
buyer's agent fee. Okay.
Yes, or the buyer brokerage fee, right? And so, and this is probably less applicable to those of you that are newer in the business, but for those of us from the past, we did need to be told to stop. Because if you notice on the listing agreement, it still does say the total is 6, and then we're going to be sharing half of that or whatever with the buyer brokerage, right? That is how we used to explain it. And so I don't know that that listing agreement form will actually get changed, but this is a better way to be describing it to a seller, that there's 2 sides to the fee. Each side has a different set of responsibilities that contribute to the total amount charged, the total amount that the seller is going to pay.
Okay.
And then this provides you a more specific example too. For all of the services I provide to you in the transaction, we charge blank. Now let's talk about the offer of compensation to the buyer brokerage. In our marketplace, most of our buyers do not have an additional 2.5% to 3% at closing to compensate their brokerage, and the lenders will not allow them to add it to the purchase price, but will allow them to have it included in the purchase price. Most buyers would rather have it a part of their transaction than pay for it at closing. And then I would add, many just don't even have the cash to begin with. So these are some specific scripts that you've got that, like I said, will be in the packet for you. So this outlines again that buyers don't necessarily have the extra cash. Lenders won't let them add it to the mortgage, at least currently. That is, I think, something else that's being worked on. I don't know how hard, or I don't have any updates on it, but I know that that's been talked about, is that maybe the mortgage guidelines need to be adjusted. And then there's the whole point here too, that if buyers do end up paying for it themselves, they're probably going to want to pay the seller less, right? So it all ends up being about the same thing. So that's why the whole idea of the complaints to begin with were just off and kind of crazy to begin with. So then moving into what we can do about it, and we can use a buyer's agency agreement. And so this establishes your compensation at the time of your agreement when you're beginning to work with the buyer. So it might become a part of the process as to whether or not you and the buyer even decide to work together or not. But this way, you and the buyer determine your compensation, not the seller and the listing agent. You're able to talk about the value that you bring to a buyer throughout the process. And then the buyer will have the option to pay the fee or pay the difference if the seller isn't offering a high enough selling office commission. You do, however, need to show all of the properties that fit the buyer's needs, and you must disclose if the offer of compensation doesn't match the agreement prior to showing. So I think we've kind of talked about that before, where even if you don't have a signed buyer's agency agreement, it's a good idea to have talked about your minimum compensation, right? So you have had that conversation with your buyers. Now, they're probably not looking at that selling office commission on the MLS or on other websites. So what you'll want to do is check it before you run out and show a property. And then if it's lower than what you talk to your clients about, such as if maybe it's lower than 2.5 and 2.5 is your minimum, then you'd want to remind them. And then at that point, your client can decide, oh, okay, well, I don't have the cash to pay the difference, so let's forget about that one. Or with the written buyer's agency agreement, so a signed one, you can contact the listing broker and say, hey, I have a buyer's agency agreement for 2.5%, but you're listed at 2%. So is the seller willing and able to pay another 5%? And then if they should either have an answer to that and talk to the seller about it already, or maybe they need to talk to the seller and get an answer, and then they would let you know. And in some cases, the answer might be, oh, yes, they just wanted to advertise a lower selling office commission. Or in some cases, it may be that, no, they really don't have the cash or don't want to. And so then you would have to share that information with your buyer and then let your buyer make the decision, right? Because if the buyer's going to need to pay the difference, are they able to? If they aren't able to, then you might need to move on to a different property. If they are, well, then at least they're aware of the situation while they're there touring the property. And this kind of summarizes what I had just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
That as a listing agent, if you have something advertised for less than what a buyer's broker minimum is, and you get a call, you do need to check with the seller to find out, well, are they willing and able to pay that difference or not? And then the form that you would use to negotiate a difference in the commission, like let's say, for example, your minimum's 2.5 and the advertised SOC is 2. There's the form 41C that is, I've made it available as a part of the templates in all of the sale templates. So it's there as a reminder for when you're writing an offer of, oh, is the SOC what I need it to be? If it is, great, you can just delete that form. If not, well, then it's there for you. And I put it in there just as a reminder to double check the SOC, because for a lot of us that have been around a while, we didn't used to check selling office commissions, you know, to be honest, almost all of them were 3% all the time. This wasn't an issue like it's become now.
No,
so
right
it's
now.
different. Yeah. And so that was something that I did to just serve as a reminder, you know, to check the SOC.
So you said the form 41C
Yes.
in the templates. In the
Yeah,
templates.
Yeah, and it's in the forms section. If you use the office sale templates, it's there. Now, if you don't have a buyer's agency agreement, then you're going to be stuck. And I don't think you've been in this situation, but I know, and I don't think Misty would mind me sharing it. She had shown some new construction to a buyer that was, thankfully it was at 2%. So it was higher than
not
some.
too bad.
Yeah, because there's some that are out there at 0 or 1.
There.
And she texted me, she's like, this is at 2%. What am I going to do? And I'm like, well, did you talk to your buyer about your minimum compensation? And she hadn't. And so that's where, thankfully, the buyer didn't want to buy that one. But, you know, if you haven't talked about your minimum compensation, then you're stuck. You would be stuck accepting that 2%. And so that's why it is best to have the conversation ahead of time. I typically do it during my buyer's consultation, either via Zoom or in person. I talk to them about it. And then the buyer's agency agreement is in my buyer's packet that I give to them. And I let them know it's in there and they can review it. Now there's a sample buyer's agency agreement on Dropbox as well in the folder buyers and agency. And so it's filled out for you with what I recommend and what an attorney recommends for the last paragraph so that you can negotiate a difference in your compensation and also negotiate with for sale by owners too. So all you would need to do is put in your name at the top, have your client sign the bottom left of the second page and you sign the bottom right. So it's all ready to go for you with what I recommend should be the defaults for filling in. And so the default that I have set up in there for you is exclusive agency, meaning that you are their one agent and they're going to be working with you. And that the term of the agreement is for 180 days, which is 6 months.
Half a year.
Yeah. And then the minimum is set at 2.5. So of course your minimum is up to you. I've had some agents not in this office now, but the one I previously managed. Her minimum was 3, and she had 3 in there. And she has worked well that way, so it's worked for her. For me, I've always been willing to, I guess, accept 2.5 if that's what it was, but that is my bare minimum. Like, you know, I will not work for less. And when I talk to clients about it, I always equate it back to percentages. And let me run the percentage again really quick, but I think 0.05 divided by 3, yeah, it's 17%. So I always let them know that, hey, you know, I can work at a 17% discount, but not a 33% discount. I can't provide the same services and give you 100% of my time and energy to get paid for only 2/3 of it. It just doesn't work.
So you mean that 2%?
Yeah.
The compensation 2%. Okay.
Yeah. Because that's usually what the jump is, right? Like there's very few, I think I've seen them, but there's very few 2.25s. Usually they're 3, 2.5, 2 or less. And so I just provide that as an example that, you know, I can work for 17% less, but no more than that. And usually they're like, oh yeah, and they totally agree and there's no problem. If they're kind of like just sitting there and, you know, don't agree right away, then always provide the example of, well, would you want to perform the same amount of work for your employer for a week and then get less than 20% of what you were expecting? And most are like, oh no. And so then when you turn it around for them, then that's usually when it works, if it didn't work the other way. Let's see where we at. Yeah, I think we've pretty much just kind of talked about all of that. These are some example flyers that the National Association of Realtors have that are included in a packet on Dropbox and that I'll email you. So because there's some folks out there that believe like the MLS is the big bad thing. And so this flyer actually shows how it really benefits everyone. Sellers get more exposure and buyers have more information, more accurate information too. And then this is a flyer. Oh, oops, skipped ahead. This is a flyer about all of the things that a real estate agent does for a buyer. And this one's also included in the packet, but there's also another version in Dropbox too, that's just in the buyers and agency folder. That is a really nice flyer that you could include in your buyer packets. So it's even another version of this that I think is good to use. And then this is another one, 3 ways to maximize the value of your real estate agent. So these are all just nice flyers that you could use as you want to in your buyer packets to help explain the value of us, right? And why we're worth that 2.5 or 3%, whatever your minimum is going to be. I guess just as kind of a finishing note, just a reminder that I definitely think a conversation with buyers near the very beginning should be your first meeting, but if not your first for some reason, definitely your second meeting. You should be talking about your commission and how you're paid. And then definitely I would provide the sample to them so they're ready to sign it. So then if there is a property out there that they're interested in seeing that's less than, say, your 2.5, you can ask them to sign it and get it signed. It's going to be much easier to do that or to just get it signed in the very beginning, rather than having to bring it up later when, oh, here's one at 2%. Well, that's less than what I work for. You know what I mean? It's going to be much easier for you if you've already talked about it before the situation comes up.
Mhm.
And in that buyers and agency folder on Dropbox, there's also a very detailed outline of how to use the buyer's agency agreement. So it explains it. So if you have a buyer that has questions about it, then you can answer their questions about it too. And it gives you tips on how to get it signed. You know, how to not that any of us would do this, but you know, you don't just hand it to them and ask them to sign it. It's more important to have a conversation about it and just talk about our industry and how we're paid and why we're where we're at, right? That buyers don't usually have the cash to pay for it. So it's been customary for sellers to pay for it, but nowadays sellers want to try a variety of compensation options, but we can't just continue to provide the same services with no guaranteed amount of pay. Hopefully that all makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Do you have any questions?
I don't have questions because we will talk about a lot about the commission things.
Yeah, I know you and I have, quite a bit.
But I know there are a lot of part-time agents out there, so they provide like a partial service and give them much discount because they have or the flat fee model.
Yes, and I guess that's part of it too, is that there are different models out there. Different brokerages have different philosophies on what they provide, right?
Yeah.
At RE/MAX here, we provide all of the marketing and technology that an agent could ever possibly use to help them work their database, streamline their transaction and closing processes and everything, so that we can be focusing on meeting more clients and converting them and closing them, right? But that's different, whereas some brokerages don't provide any of that value. You know, that's a value that a brokerage provides.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording here.